You'd think the holiest men of ancient Egypt would have clear minds, clean habits, and pristine robes. I'm your bedtime historian, and tonight I'll tell you why the opposite might be closer to the truth. Priests who stumbled through smoke-rubbed crocodile fat on their brows and brewed beer potent enough to summon visions. A high temple, a higher priesthood, and the faint scent of poppy dust still trapped in thousand-year-old stone. Why would the keepers of cosmic order embrace such intoxicating rituals? Were they chasing divinity or running from it? If you enjoy unwinding with gentle tales that smell faintly of lotus wine and mystery, maybe press like and subscribe. I can't promise enlightenment, but I can offer 2 hours of softly bizarre history. Sometimes I wonder if you could time travel for just one ritual, which ancient rite would you attend? Eyes closed, senses open. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You descend a narrow passage flanked by sandstone walls. The air is thick perfumed, not with incense, but something earthier familiar, if you've ever walked too close to a poppy field just after rain. At the base of the temple's innermost chamber, you find a dais scratched and worn, holding faint streaks of residue. Modern analysis says it's the opium alkaloid the bane, trapped in the crevices for thousands of years. Here, sacred duties weren't just about reciting hymns or lighting oil lamps. They involved preparing inhaling, and perhaps even imbibing substances meant to thin the veil between mortal and divine. Poppies long grown along the Nile were known for their sedative and euphoric effects. Whether crushed into pastes or brewed into teas, they played roles in healing and less publicly in communion. One mainstream historical fact we do know. The Ebers Papyrus, a medical scroll from around 1550 BCE, lists poppy-based remedies for soothing crying children and treating pain. But nestled in these same temples were rituals that may have moved beyond medicine into something closer to ecstasy. Quirky details abound. Some temple recipes mixed poppy juice with honey and set it into waxy pellets placed beneath the tongue during long chants. Others were burned in shallow bowls, their smoke curling through lattice screens carved with protective symbols. You can almost picture a priest, eyes half-lidded, swaying slightly as a chorus hums in the background, smoke curling around his shaved head like a halo of narcotic fog. But historians remain divided. Were these truly sacred rites, or simply priestly indulgences cloaked in divine language? Some scholars argue these substances were only used for medicinal or symbolic purposes, never to reach an altered state. Others point to art and cryptic hymns that seem to describe journeys inward, not outward. There is no scholarly consensus on just how high the priesthood truly got, but the physical evidence, residues, recipes, temple designs invites quiet curiosity. And in a religion where God spoke through dreams and omens, perhaps the line between medicine and mysticism was never meant to be clear. The chamber fades behind you now, the scent of dried petals and warm stone lingering like a ghost. But just beyond the next lintel, a different fragrance beckons, something sweet, fermented, and tinged with flower. You step forward, following the scent of steeped lotus petals and wine-soaked wisdom. A faint hum of music lingers in the corridor as you move toward the next chamber. The scent changes, less earthy, more floral now. It clings to your nostrils like memory, sweet, heady, and slightly bitter beneath the surface. This is not a perfume, it is a preparation. You're about to meet the Blue Lotus. In the quiet hours before dawn, Egyptian priests often drank wine steeped with petals of the blue lotus Nymphaea caerulea. Unlike the white or pink varieties this specific flower was thought to have, spiritual potency visions, clarity communion. Its effects were mild by modern pharmacological standards, but amplified by ritual suggestion and belief. To a priest of Horus or Isis, One sip might unlock a door only gods could pass through. Ritual scrolls describe vessels lined with soft linen, soaked in a lotus and wine, reduction left to ferment under sunlit courtyards. When ready, the wine turned an almost indigo hue. Cups were shallow and servings small. But here's the quirky twist. Some rituals paired lotus wine with long sequences of hand movements as if choreography mattered as much as chemistry. One arm lifted 2 fingers, curled a pause, and drink. The mainstream historical record does recognize the Blue Lotus as symbolic of rebirth. It closes at night and opens with the morning sun, a motif that echoed Egyptian ideas of death and regeneration. Temple murals often show deities offering lotus flowers to pharaohs, tokens of eternal life. But were these gestures purely metaphorical? Some scholars remain puzzled by the pharmacological properties of the lotus. It contains a porphyrin compound with mild sedative and euphoric effects. Not quite a psychedelic, but enough to soften the senses. Still, whether it truly produced visions or merely relaxation is a matter of academic debate. Imagine for a moment a line of priests seated on carved limestone benches, robes pressed and eyes half lowered. Each holds a cup, no bigger than a walnut shell. The silence breaks only for chanting the same phrase over and over. In that rhythm, in that darkness, with just the shimmer of lamplight and the sweet taste of petals, the world might indeed blur into the sacred. The preparation of the drink was in itself a sacred task. Initiates had to be trained to identify the right petals, harvest them under the correct moon, and ferment the wine precisely the right number of days. One legend passed from priest to priest claimed that if the wine sat one day too long, it soured and dreams turned to nightmares. Superstition? Possibly. But no one risked drinking spoiled dreams. From a modern lens, it's easy to assume exaggeration. But temples were not stages for public drama. They were chambers of secrecy. What happened within might never be spoken aloud again. And so, we're left with fragments, dried petals in jars, painted gods handing over flowers and verses that speak of eyes opening within. Your journey through the chamber ends as a cool breeze brushes against your cheek, unnatural, in this windowless space. It smells like incense and something smoky sweet. Another ritual awaits one built not on drink, but on air and flame. The moment you step across the threshold, the air changes again, denser now, almost textured. You can feel it gathering in your lungs with every breath, like you're inhaling velvet. Smoke curls from bronze braziers, shaped like lotus buds, their petals blackened by years of use. Welcome to the realm of perfumed hallucinations. Ancient Egyptian temples weren't quiet, sterile spaces. They were theatrical, aromatic, and overwhelming. Priests choreographed scent the way others choreograph sound. Blends of frankincense, myrrh, juniper, galbanum, and even psychotropic herbs were burned in precise sequences to evoke emotional and spiritual states. Some scents were calming, others were designed to stimulate or disorient. One mainstream historical fact, the Kaifi incense, one of the most famous temple blends, appears in multiple ancient recipes. It included as many as 16 ingredients: raisins, honey, cinnamon, wine, resin, and more ground boiled dried and formed into pellets. These weren't random perfumes. They were sacred formulas, some so revered they were stored in golden jars behind locked doors. But the quirky detail you'll remember is this. Some rituals required the temple doors to be sealed completely. The goal was saturation. Every robe, every scroll, every hair follicle infused with scent. And sometimes the smoke wasn't just fragrant. Several scholars now speculate that certain Kaifi variants may have included psychoactive elements like mandrake or henbane, known in the ancient world for their visionary properties. There is no scholarly consensus on whether these incense rituals consistently induced altered states. Some argue the levels were too low to cause real hallucinations. Others believe the cumulative effect, combined with fasting chanting and sleep deprivation, could have triggered legitimate trance experiences. It's not hard to imagine. Your kneeling eyes close the air so thick you feel it brushing your eyelashes. A priest swings a censer and slow circles the chain, clinking with hypnotic rhythm. You smell sweetness first, then something darker, earthy, slightly sour, almost animal. Your heartbeat slows. The chanting rises. Shadows ripple on the walls. Were those just smoke patterns or something else? One account preserved on a fragment of temple wall mentions a priest seeing the eye of Ra blinking in the smoke. Was that metaphor artistic license, or did he genuinely believe he saw it? In any case, scent wasn't passive. It was a bridge. The gods, it was said, fed on incense. To inhale with them was to commune with them, however briefly, however fuzzily. Even the process of lighting the braziers was ritualized. Not just flame and herb, but also gesture and intention. Left hand for cleansing, right hand for invocation. The exact order mattered. One mistake could, in theory, spoil the contact with the divine. No pressure. You step through the lingering haze, feeling it cling to your skin like gauze. Somewhere behind you, the embers crackle, a final puff of smoke trailing toward the ceiling. The next room lies ahead, lined with curious jars and strange pastes. You catch a glint of something slick, greenish, faintly iridescent. It's crocodile fat, and it's just the beginning of tonight's strangest pharmacopoeia. The floor feels colder here, smoother underfoot. You've entered the storage wing, a dim corridor of ceramic jars and beeswax-sealed pots. Shelves sag gently under the weight of strange substances. Some shimmer, others reek. And tucked among the most sacred vials is a jar marked with the unmistakable hieroglyph for crocodile. Yes, crocodile fat. Apparently, the gods had eclectic taste in ointments. Ancient Egyptian pharmacopoeia didn't draw sharp lines between the mystical and the medical. The same salve that cured a rash might also open your third eye, at least according to temple tradition. And while some concoctions were rooted in genuine medicinal effect, others ventured into what we might politely call experimental chemistry. Let's start with the crocodile. Its fat was prized not just for its texture, but for its symbolism. This was an apex predator, feared and revered, often associated with the god Sobek. To rub crocodile oil onto one's forehead or temples was thought to absorb its strength and possibly its proximity to the divine. Mixed with crushed herbs and cooled beeswax, it became a standard preparation before vision quests or night vigils. One mainstream historical fact: the Ebers Papyrus and the Hearst Medical Papyrus both document hundreds of remedies, some shockingly sophisticated. But they also include entries like ointment for opening the ears to voices unseen, which frankly sounds more like spell work than science. And the quirky stuff keeps coming. One preserved formula, combined fermented fig juice, acacia, resin, powdered turquoise, and yes, a sliver of mummy dust. Not the most ethical ingredient by modern standards, but in temple logic, ancestral remains held spiritual charge. Blend that with a bit of date syrup, and voila, a thick tonic that priests dab beneath the tongue before entering trance chambers. Some scholars remain skeptical. Could these strange salves really induce altered states? Maybe they were symbolic or psychosomatic. But others argue that many of these preparations had genuine pharmacological effects, especially when layered with the fasting rhythmic movement and sensory deprivation. Imagine yourself standing by a stone basin, gently heating a grayish paste over a flame. The scent is bitter like burnt sugar and stale river mud. You dip your fingers in, smear a line along each temple, and feel an odd tingling spread across your scalp. Is it the herbs or your anticipation? Priests were meticulous. Dosing rituals had strict timing. Some ointments required application at dawn, others only once stars were visible. The body's humors, planetary alignments, and even the day's color, yes, color, played into the decision. Tuesdays, for instance, were thought to favor lunar influence. Don't ask why. Just nod, apply, and hum softly. And there's one final peculiar touch: the priest's pocket stone. Carried during rituals, it was often coated in a resin made from the same tonics. Priests would grip it tightly during chants, pressing it between palm and thigh. Supposedly, this grounded the effects of the salve, channeling energy through the body. Or maybe it just kept their hands busy. As you leave the apothecary-like chamber, your mind buzzes faintly. Not from real ointments, but from the idea of them. Just ahead, carved into the next threshold, is a symbol, the Jed pillar. A spine, a column, a mystery, and perhaps a cosmic conduit. The chamber narrows ceiling rising slightly as you enter a sanctum that feels taller than the rest. You look up. Carved high into the stone are Jed pillars, stacked bars topped with a bulbous crown, like vertebrae leading to heaven. Most visitors think of them as decorative, but to the temple priests they were more than symbols of stability. They were tools strange, sacred, and possibly psychoactive. The Jed, often linked to the god Osiris, represented the backbone of the universe. It stood for endurance, resurrection, and cosmic order. But in certain priestly contexts, it also became an axis of transformation. Some rituals called for participants to sit directly beneath suspended Djed effigies, while low chanting vibrated through the air. The goal, alignment not just of the spine, but of spirit and sensation. One mainstream historical fact: the annual raising of the Jed was a public festival during which priests and citizens physically hoisted a giant pillar upright, a moment echoing creation myths. But in the private recesses of temples, Jed use was subtler, more interior. And here's where things get quirky. Some smaller Jed totems were hollow, filled with aromatic resins or dampened reeds. They were designed to amplify sound. Whisper into one end, and a low tone would travel through. Priests used them during rituals to create droning harmonics, an auditory loop said to anchor the soul. There's no scholarly consensus on how frequently these tools were used, or whether their effects were more emotional than neurological. But some archaeologists now speculate that temple acoustics and Djed placements created standing waves. Combined with rhythmic movement and inhaled incense, these sessions might have induced trance-like experiences. Imagine sitting cross-legged in a circular alcove, the only light coming from flickering oil lamps. A Jed pillar looms before you, its base fitted into a stone socket. A priest begins humming, low, continuous. As the tone deepens, the pillar starts to resonate, not moving, but subtly singing. Your breath slows, your body still, and somewhere between seconds, you stop feeling quite alone. One preserved scroll describes the Jed as the ladder the gods descend. Whether metaphor or literal belief, the idea shaped generations of priestly practice. To touch the Jed was to center oneself within divine rhythm. It's said some priests refused food before Jed rites fearing digestion would scatter the spine's light. A little dramatic, but faith tends to stretch metaphor into method. There's even speculation that specific poses, early forms of body alignment, perhaps precursors to yoga, were practiced around the Djed. Some depictions show priests in strange seated postures, hands forming mudra-like symbols. Coincidence or lost technique? As you leave the sanctuary, a soft vibration seems to echo in your chest, like the faint memory of a sound long faded. You pass beneath one last Jed, carving fingers brushing its cool grooves. But beyond this quiet order waits chaos or transformation. The next chamber pulses with noise color, and something stranger, men and women donning golden masks, arms outstretched, voices lifted. Possession isn't feared here, it's welcomed. The room ahead flickers with torchlight. Shadows dance on the walls, shifting faster than the flames should allow. You hear low moans, not of pain, but of ecstasy or rapture, voices stretched by reverence or something deeper. This is not prayer as you've known it. This is divine possession. Here the priest didn't just worship the gods. Sometimes they became them. At the height of certain rituals, Egyptian clergy entered states where they claimed to channel deities directly. Osiris, Hathor, Thoth, the full divine entourage had their earthly emissaries. These weren't polite impersonations or recited hymns. They were full-body takeovers, trembling limbs, altered voices, sudden fluency in obscure dialects. Whether you call it mysticism or performance, the results were spellbinding. One mainstream historical fact: the opening of the mouth ceremony, usually performed on statues and mummies, occasionally featured a priest acting as the god Horus, using gestures and phrases meant to wake the senses. But some records hint that possession rituals weren't reserved for the dead. They were used in life for healing judgment or prophecy. A quirky detail preserved in temple marginalia tells of a priestess who, after donning a lioness mask, leapt from a platform and danced in circles for nearly an hour, roaring in what was described as an unearthly voice. Was it an act? An altered state? A little of both. Some scholars argue that these possessions were symbolic tools to lend authority or mystery to religious declarations. Others insist that the trances were real, chemically assisted, and passed down through training. A priest wasn't merely chosen, he was conditioned. The process could take weeks. Fasting, chanting, isolation, and, as we've already seen, substances ranging from poppy to mandrake. Add to that the power of expectation, the pressure of performance, and the belief that a god would enter through one's breath, and something happened. Maybe not divine, but certainly not ordinary. Picture yourself watching from the shadows. A priest stands in white linen, head-bowed lips moving silently. The room smells of cedar and lotus. At the signal, 3 notes from a harp, the priest lifts his arms. The chanting deepens. He begins to sway. Slowly, rhythmically, then faster. His fingers twitch. His mouth opens, and a voice not quite his emerges. The congregation responds, eyes wide, knees bent, hands upturned. They are not worshiping him. They are worshiping who he has become. And this was no solo act. Some temples featured full ensembles, drummers, flautists, singers, even costumed attendants, ready to catch the possessed if they stumbled or fainted. The line between sacred and theatrical was vanishingly thin. There is no scholarly agreement on how often these events occurred or how widespread the practice was. But even conservative records suggest that, at least in elite temples, possession was not only accepted, it was cultivated. As the vision ends, the chamber fades into soft stillness. You're left with the rustle of linen robes and the after scent of incense. What comes next isn't so dramatic. It's quieter, more cerebral. A chamber of scrolls and tonics where the line between medicine and mysticism begins to blur. The noise subsides as you step into the next space, a cool, dim library of jars and papyri. Here, no one dances, no one chants. But the air hums with a different energy curiosity. Shelves sag with clay bottles labeled in careful hieroglyphs, next to scrolls tied in linen strips. This is where the priests measured doses, not destinies. Or did they? You're in the heart of a sacred pharmacy, where the boundaries between healing and holiness dissolved like herbs in warm wine. To the ancient Egyptians, illness wasn't merely physical. It could be caused by malevolent spirits, divine punishment, or imbalance in the body's humors. And so, the treatments mirrored the cause's spells to chase demons, rituals to appease gods, and plant-based tonics to soothe the body, all administered by the same men who led the choirs and burned the incense. One mainstream historical fact. Many temples operated as medical centers. The Temple of Calm Ambo, for instance, housed surgical tools, procedure diagrams, and even patient records etched into stone. Yet right next to those instruments were hymns to Sobek and incantations against nightmares, medicine and magic co-authors on every prescription. A quirky detail. Some prescriptions included odd instructions like, write these words in ink made of pomegranate rind and goat's blood, then eat the papyrus. Not quite the dosage method your local pharmacist would recommend. But in temple logic, consuming sacred words could strengthen the medicine's effect or transform the body into a divine vessel. Researchers continue to debate whether these preparations were truly effective or more placebo than panacea. Some formulas, like those using willow bark, a precursor to aspirin, clearly had real benefits. Others, like drinking oil mixed with powdered emerald, might have been less about healing and more about aligning with divine frequencies. Yes, emeralds had a vibration, supposedly. You could sip your way to clarity, assuming your stomach didn't rebel. Imagine a priest seated on a low stool, grinding dried herbs with a curved pestle. He murmurs to himself, not nonsense, but spell fragments matching each motion to a line of verse. He spoons the powder into a tiny cone of wax, folds it in linen, and places it beside a sleeping patient. Not to be eaten, but inhaled slowly through the cloth. A scented message from God to lungs. The logic wasn't entirely irrational. The ancients knew some smells calmed the mind, while others quickened the pulse. They just attributed these effects to divine favor rather than neurotransmitters. The result? A system of care that was as poetic as it was pharmacological. No scholar today fully agrees on the intent behind these blended practices. Were the priests earnest healers, opportunistic gatekeepers of mysticism, or simply following protocols handed down from centuries past, too old and revered to question? The scrolls offer no answers, only instructions. And so, as you pass between the racks of dusty wisdom, you can't help but wonder how much of modern medicine will seem magical in 3,000 years. The air changes again. Warmer now, with a faint tang of barley, a clink of ceramic mugs, a bubbling vat. You're headed toward the brewmaster's corner, where dreams were fermented, bottled, and poured. The scent hits you first, warm, yeasty, and just a little sweet, like bread left too long in the sun. You've entered the brewery, but this isn't the bustling, beer-soaked hall you might expect. It's hushed, sacred. The brewing here isn't for festivals or feasts. It's for sleep vision and communion. Temple priests were more than healers, and historians, they were brewers of dreams. Ancient Egyptian beer, unlike the modern frothy pint, was thick, cloudy, and closer to a porridge than a pour. Made from partially baked loaves of emmer wheat mixed with dates and sometimes herbs, it was nutritious, intoxicating, and surprisingly versatile. And in temples, it became a base for more esoteric experiments. One mainstream historical fact, brewing was deeply embedded in religious practice. The goddess Hathor was said to have saved humanity by drinking so much drugged beer that her bloodlust subsided. Temples often maintained dedicated brew rooms, cool, dark chambers where fermentation happened, slowly watched over by initiates with recipes memorized like prayers. The quirky part. Some of these beers were deliberately spiked not with poison, but with psychoactive herbs like mandrake, blue lotus, and even henbane. These enhanced brews weren't consumed at dinner. They were reserved for rituals requiring altered consciousness, prophecy, dream incubation, or divine visitations. Some scholars argue that the amounts were too low to cause strong effects. Others suggest the long fermenting process might have concentrated certain compounds. There is, as always, no scholarly consensus, only residues, hints, and side notes in forgotten scrolls. Picture a young priest kneeling beside a ceramic vat, carefully adding dried petals into a sludgy mixture. He stirs with a paddle carved with protective symbols, then chants a phrase 7 times, never 6, never 8. Later, the brew will be ladled into small lidded cups and placed on an altar. Only senior priests may drink it. The rest must watch and wait. These intoxicating brews weren't just about the drink, though. The experience included sound, scent, posture, and timing. Some rituals required the drinker to lie on woven mats, while the junior acolyte played a single-stringed instrument in the background. Others took place at dusk, with the drink consumed between 2 bronze mirrors, said to reflect the soul's journey inward. And it wasn't only about getting high. Beer was a connector to ancestors, to gods, to one's deeper self. By combining the familiarity of a daily beverage with unfamiliar effects, priests may have created a shortcut to transcendence, or at least to something that felt close. A recipe found on a scrap of papyrus includes this final line, "Drink in silence. If your ears ring, the god is near," charming and slightly ominous. You leave the brewery behind the floor, sticky with ancient spills. Ahead, the stone cools under your feet. The scent of barley fades, replaced by something subtler, lavender perhaps, or was that fig smoke? You're entering the dream chambers next, not to sleep, but to witness how dreams became prescriptions and visions, sacred cures. The hallway narrows and the walls begin to shimmer, not with actual light, but with faint iridescent paint. Images of sleeping figures crowned with stars line the stone. You step into a chamber, unlike any before. No fire, no clamor, just silence and rows of low couches carved from alabaster. Welcome to the sleep temple. Long before modern psychiatry, ancient Egyptian priests were already treating dreams as medicine. These sanctuaries, sometimes called houses of healing, invited the ailing to sleep under divine supervision, hoping that a god would visit them in the night and whisper the cure. One mainstream historical fact: the practice of incubation ritual sleep for the purpose of divine messages was widespread in both Egypt and later Greece. Temples dedicated to Imhotep, the deified physician, regularly hosted patients seeking nocturnal guidance. Records show some even slept for multiple nights, fasting and bathing beforehand to prepare their minds. But the quirky details make the space come alive. Some sleepers wore masks, linen veils embroidered with the eye of Horus, meant to see the vision inward. Others were anointed with dream ointments rich with chamomile poppy extract and honey. These weren't just sleep aids, they were signals to the gods. We're ready. Please appear. Some scholars argue that many of these dreams were the result of suggestion or mild intoxication. Others believe that under such focused conditions, the brain naturally slipped into deeper dream states. There's even ongoing research into whether temple acoustics enhance lucid dreaming, subtle echoes lulling the mind into creative quiet. Imagine lying on one of these sacred beds wrapped in a fine linen shroud. A soft bell chimes from a nearby corridor. You've fasted all day. Your stomach is light, your breath shallow. A priest enters, places a small clay figurine beside you. You're a dream witness and then leaves. The room darkens. A breeze seems to pass, though no windows exist. And slowly you drift. Some dreams were vivid, even terrifying. One scroll tells of a man who dreamt he was devoured by a serpent, only to wake cured of his leg paralysis. Another spoke of a woman who dreamt of floating down the Nile in reverse. She woke with no more migraines. Coincidence. Healing interpretation played a large role. Priests weren't just dreamers, they were interpreters. Each morning, patients would describe their visions, and the priests would offer translations, sometimes symbolic. The serpent means renewal, sometimes actionable, avoid water for 3 days. And if a dream failed to come, they would try again the next night. These chambers weren't limited to the sick. Pilgrims, nobles, even scribes came to seek dreams not just for healing, but for wisdom. What job to take, what path to follow, what offering to make. The gods, it was believed, preferred whispering through sleep. As you exit the chamber, your steps feel slower, as if caught in that in-between space of dreaming and waking. But your senses are about to jolt back to life. The next hall is no sanctuary. It's a storm of smells, of colors, of creatures. Ready yourself for snakes, for echoes, and for a bath unlike any other. The silence breaks before you even enter. A soft hiss, the clatter of water, the faint chime of metal on stone. You step into a room that feels alive, not with people, but with sensations. A snake slithers lazily across a mosaic floor. Steam rises from hidden vents. Somewhere above, a flute trills a single circling note. Welcome to the sensory temple. Here the priests didn't just appeal to sight or sound. They designed entire rituals around overwhelming the senses, layering smell, texture, vibration, and temperature into a kind of sacred synesthesia. Every visitor, whether ill-devout or curious, was meant to be unmoored, unbalanced, and then recentered. One mainstream historical fact. Certain temples were acoustically engineered with curved ceilings and echo chambers built to amplify specific frequencies. Some shrines had niches that created long, eerie reverberations when chants were sung. You wouldn't just hear the prayer, you'd feel it ripple through your bones. And the smells, oh, the smells. Blends of myrrh, cardamom, marjoram, crushed juniper, and sometimes something less expected. Onion, yes, onion. Not for eating, but for burning. The sharpness was said to wake the gods. Other herbs like spikenard or fenugreek were mixed into wax and pressed against warm walls, melting slowly to perfume the space throughout the night. The quirky detail. Some baths weren't filled with water at all. Instead, acolytes filled them with barley milk and palm wine lightly warmed. Visitors would lie inside, while attendants poured fragrant oils onto the surface, creating a shimmering film of scent and heat. Combined with hypnotic flute music and low chanting, the effect was, by all accounts, otherworldly. Researchers continue to debate the purpose of these multi-sensory rituals. Were they meant for healing entertainment or spiritual transport? Some say they were intended to simulate divine presence. If you could trick the senses, maybe you could convince the soul. Imagine standing in the center of the room, barefoot on wet tile. Your eyes sting slightly from fragrant smoke, your ears filled with overlapping chants and instrument tones. A priest brushes your shoulder with a feather dipped in wine, not for blessing, just to heighten the contrast when a bucket of cool water is later poured over your back. Pleasure and discomfort layered deliberately. Snakes were sacred here too, not just symbols of rebirth, but actual participants. Certain rites required the presence of live serpents, placed carefully beside the bathers. It was said that if the snake lay still, the spirits were pleased. If it slithered away, you might want to postpone your ritual, and the sounds weren't left to chance. Wind harps were strung across hidden grates, turning natural breezes into soft, eerie music. Even the water channels had musical notches causing a gentle warble as liquid moved through. There is no unified scholarly view on whether these environments truly altered consciousness, but many agree the sensory flood could induce trance states or at least deep relaxation. The temples knew what spa designers learned. Millennia later, the body is the gate to the mind. As you step out, skin damp and ears still ringing slightly, a hush returns. You're walking now into the quarters of the highest priests, the ones who had access to all these tools, and sometimes use them to hold power. You pass under a low arch etched with gold-leafed symbols, serpent stars, and eyes that seem to watch you as you move. The floors here are smoother, the air cooler. No incense burns, no chance echo. This is a space reserved for a different kind of elevation, not spiritual, political. You've entered the sanctum of Egypt's elite priesthood, where sacred states met strategic ambitions. High priests in ancient Egypt were not just religious leaders, they were administrators, scholars, healers, and quietly power brokers. And sacred intoxication wasn't merely a rite, it was leverage. One mainstream historical fact: the high priest of Amun, especially during the New Kingdom, wielded immense influence. At certain times, his authority rivaled even that of the pharaoh. He controlled temple lands, resources, and rituals, and often access to the divine itself. But the quirky layer: these men didn't just guide others through altered states. They often reserved the strongest substances and most potent rituals for themselves. Special brews, isolated trance chambers, secret blends of incense not shared with lower clergy. Even the colors of their linens were different, deeper indigos and golds thought to anchor them in higher realms. Some scholars remain divided on whether this use of altered states was primarily spiritual or political. Did the priests truly believe they communed with gods, or were they orchestrating divine theater to reinforce their status? The truth perhaps lies somewhere in between. Imagine the scene. A procession moves slowly through a courtyard. At its center, the high priest walks barefoot, eyes half closed, his skin glistening with oil. Onlookers whisper that he has not eaten in 4 days, that he drank the sun brew that morning, that he will speak only when the god enters. And when he finally does speak, his voice low, reverberating, it's taken as prophecy. These performances were powerful because they could not be disproven. The god said what the priest said. And the more distant or altered the priest appeared, the more divine his pronouncements seemed. They even had a term: becoming the mouth of God. Once in this role, a priest might settle disputes, dictate agricultural decisions, or bless military campaigns. And if his hands trembled or his pupils widened, that only confirmed the god had arrived. Behind closed doors, special rituals included the reading of forbidden scrolls, texts not just about cosmology, but about controlling perception. One fragment advises, "Let the light fall behind the veil, let the scent precede the word." Subtle cues, carefully controlled environments. In other words, a masterclass in immersive persuasion. There's even record of a chamber with no light at all, only scent and sound. High priests would spend hours or days inside, emerging pale, silent, and changed. Whether it was genuine trance or curated mystique hardly mattered. The effect was the same: awe. You step out of the chamber with a strange clarity. The quiet here doesn't erase the manipulation, it deepens it. And just as you begin to question what's real, you turn a corner and are hit by color: reds, blues, golds, images swirling across a tomb wall, visions or memories you're about to find out. The hallway opens abruptly into a vast painted chamber, its walls lit by slivers of flickering torchlight. You don't need a guide here. The images speak for themselves, or try to. Reds swirl into greens, human figures stretch and twist. Eyes gaze from unlikely places. This is no ordinary tomb. This is a fresco of fevered visions, dizzying, distorted, and entirely intentional. Tomb paintings in Egypt were more than decoration. They were blueprints for the afterlife, visual spells to guide the soul. But in some chambers, particularly those linked to high-ranking priests or mystic cults, the imagery grows strange, almost psychedelic. One mainstream historical fact: the Amduat and Book of the Dead were not just texts, but visual guides painted on tomb walls detailing the journey through the underworld. They featured gods, monsters, rivers of fire, and barks of stars. But in certain tombs, particularly in Deir el-Medina, artists took liberties: elongated limbs, multiplied heads, looping staircases that defied geometry. The quirky part. Some of these motifs closely mirror known effects of altered states, disassociation, synesthesia, loss of scale. A human form becomes a swirl. Eyes float in lotus petals. In one tomb, a priest's Ka soul is shown diving into the pupil of a crocodile. Artistic expression, or someone trying to capture what they actually saw. Some scholars remain skeptical. Perhaps the artists were simply imaginative or influenced by foreign iconography. But others suggest these tombs reflect first-hand experiences with psychoactive rituals. They weren't guessing, they were remembering. Imagine standing before one of these walls. You trace your fingers along the painted outline of a figure, its body bending backward in an impossible arc, its face half beast, half star. The text below reads, "He sees what no eye can bear, and yet he walks forward." It's poetic and unnerving. Certain pigments used in tombs like Egyptian blue fluoresce under UV light. Some researchers believe these paintings were originally meant to be experienced by flickering torchlight or glowing embers giving the illusions movement. In the right state of mind, a god could appear to blink or breathe. And the colors weren't chosen for beauty alone. Red signaled danger or power, green rebirth, yellow the divine. Layered together, they weren't just decoration. They were visual spells. Some rituals even instructed initiates to stare at a specific color combination before sleep to summon the dream pathway. There's one particularly strange mural, a staircase leading into a mouth, which leads to a river, which leads to a lotus inside, which a child sleeps. Scholars call it the cycle diagram, but no one fully agrees what it means. One theory posits it's a map of rebirth. Another suggests it's a visual echo of a hallucinatory journey, a memory encoded in pigment. As you step back from the wall, the torch's movement creates a ripple. For a moment, it looks as if the mural exhales, but no time to linger. You smell something new, wax herbs a sharp tang of something chemical. The air thickens again, but this time it's not from incense. You're entering a chamber where the very air was designed to cloud the mind. A fine mist clings to your skin the moment you enter. The room is warmer, damper, yet somehow metallic. The walls glisten faintly as if they've been rubbed with oil or some strange sap. You're surrounded by stone braziers, all unlit now, but their residue lingers. Welcome to the fumigation chamber, where priests didn't just burn incense, they weaponized the air. Egyptian temples were often perfume places, but some chambers went beyond fragrance into fumigation. They were sealed environments where carefully mixed vapors induced clarity or confusion. These spaces weren't about worship. They were laboratories of altered perception. One mainstream historical fact: beeswax was frequently used in temples not just for candles or sealants, but as a base for aromatic pellets. These wax globes infused with herbs and resins were set atop hot stones until they bubbled and released thick scented smoke. Some were calming, others stimulating, and a few probably disorienting. The quirky layer. Some wax mixtures included crushed minerals, sulfur, natron, even powdered bronze. When heated, these released not only scent, but odd colors and effects. One record even mentions the priest's blindness, a temporary condition attributed to inhaling too much fumigant during night rituals. Others describe dreamless sleeps that lasted longer than the moon's rising. Some scholars argue these effects were unintentional, just the side effect of poor ventilation and experimental ingredients. Others believe they were deliberate. Recipes suggest exact measurements, sequences of addition, and cooling intervals. There's even a scroll that describes mixing in frog skin for softness of vision. Interpret that however you like. Imagine sitting cross-legged in a chamber barely taller than you. A priest enters and with practiced hands drops a wax pellet onto a heated bronze plate. It bubbles, hisses, and melts into a thick plume. The scent is sweet at first, like dates and pine, but quickly turns sharp. Your nose tingles, the air thickens, you blink, and when you open your eyes again, the room seems to have tilted. And here's a chilling thought: some priests use these fumigants not on themselves, but on others. One document outlines a ritual called Veil of Horus, in which an initiate is left alone in a sealed room, the air laced with fumes from acacia honey, and a root no longer identifiable. He is told to remain silent, eyes closed, until the god answers. What if he doesn't? What if he does? There is no scholarly agreement on what exactly these rituals achieved. Some believe they prepared the body for prophecy. Others say they mimicked death training the soul to navigate the afterlife. And it wasn't just the smoke. Some fumigation chambers included soft fabrics hung from ceilings designed to ripple and move with the air. Combined with dim lighting and rhythmic dripping from hidden basins, the entire space became a sensory maze. As you step out, your head feels a little lighter. Whether from suggestion or storytelling, the effect is real enough. You smell papyrus now, dry, musty, ancient. Ahead lies a room of scrolls. No smoke, no sound, just instructions on how to meet a god. The hush is immediate. After the scent-thick chamber behind you, this room feels arid: dry stone, dry air, dry wisdom. Scrolls rest in rows on recessed shelves, some sealed in reed tubes, others cracked and curling at the edges. You're in the archive now. The air smells like sun-bleached linen and faint ink. These are the papyrus protocols, records of rituals, recipes, and perhaps divine appointments. Temples weren't just places of mystery, they were centers of record. And the priests, however altered their states may have been, wrote everything down. Dosage rituals, dream preparations, incantations timed to lunar phases. The margins are filled with tiny hieratic scrawls, side notes that feel like whispers across time. One mainstream historical fact: Egyptian temples maintained House of Life archives, part library, part school, part sacred vault. Within them, scribes preserved everything from medical treatments to ritual calendars, astrological tables, and hymn lyrics. Many of these scrolls were kept under guard and read only by initiated priests. But the quirky detail: some instructions were intentionally vague or encoded. Instead of writing Blue Lotus directly, a scribe might substitute a star symbol or the phrase petal of the second sky. This wasn't just poetry, it was protection. The knowledge was powerful, and not everyone was meant to access it. There is no scholarly consensus on whether these protocols were literal, metaphorical, or something in between. Some scrolls describe actions like breathe the voice of the god or place the silence behind your teeth. Beautiful, yes, but also baffling. Were they guiding physical movement, internal visualization, or both? Imagine unrolling a scroll with care, the papyrus dry and crackling beneath your fingertips. The first lines are clear. On the 7th day after the full moon, cleanse the hands with cedar. Speak not for the next hour. Let the sacred brew be warmed to body's breath. It's a ritual, but it reads like a poem, or a recipe, or a spell. Some scrolls outlined layered rites, series of actions over multiple nights involving specific chants, positions of the moon, even scents to burn. One sequence details a rite where the practitioner is to lie still, eyes open, while another priest recites an invocation backward. At the moment the moon reaches its peak, a single drop of infused oil is placed on the tongue. What follows is never described. Just the phrase, "If he is ready, he will return." The tone of these texts is always careful, always conditional. If the god listens, if the heart remains still. If the silence accepts you, there's no guarantee. The divine was not on demand. These weren't spells, they were invitations. and across several scrolls one phrase repeats, to be used only in darkness, not metaphorical darkness literal. These rites were meant to unfold in silence, in blindness, in deep stillness. The kind of conditions where one might hear or imagine a voice that isn't yours. As you leave the archive, the final scroll rolls itself back in your mind. One section remains. The questions that echo through every room you've walked. Was it real? Was it ritual? Or was it both? You're entering the present now, where modern scholars sift through this legacy still high on questions. The corridor changes once more, not in scent or sound, but in mood. The stone walls give way to glass cases, LED-lit panels, and polite explanatory plaques. You've stepped out of the temple and into the modern mind. This is not a ritual chamber. It's a museum, or a lecture hall, or maybe just the space between belief and disbelief. Welcome to the debate. Today, Egyptologists, historians, and chemists still wrestle with a peculiar question. How altered were ancient Egyptian priests during their most sacred rites? Were they high in the modern sense? Were they spiritual visionaries? Were they just extremely persuasive? One mainstream historical fact: traces of psychoactive substances like thebaine from opium poppies, compounds from blue lotus, and even henbane have been found in temple sites, burial shrouds, and ceremonial tools. Some artifacts even retain residue in their pores analyzed through modern techniques like gas chromatography. And here's the quirky tension, these finds don't come with labels. No one scratched used during trance into a stone basin. Instead, scholars piece together the evidence from fragments, half-crumbled scrolls, faint wall reliefs, oral tradition, and sometimes the suspiciously spaced footprints around a ritual bed. Some researchers argue that the priests' use of these substances was symbolic or medicinal, that poppy extracts were for pain lotus for calming nerves, and everything else merely theatrical. Others counter that the layering of sensory cues, smoke, chanting, fasting, vibration. Darkness was too deliberate, too immersive to be anything but a systematic method for altering consciousness. And the fiercest debate whether those altered states were self-induced or externally imposed. Did priests guide their own journeys? Or were they guiding others, initiates, supplicants, pilgrims into reverent compliance? Was it about communion with the divine, or control of the narrative? Imagine two scholars in a sunlit Cairo archive leaning over a papyrus fragment. One insists the ritual described is metaphor, veil of Horus, as poetic imagery. The other argues it's pharmacological, a coded dosing schedule. They sip coffee, they underline hieroglyphs. They disagree completely, and perhaps they always will, because the temples themselves are silent now. The braziers are cold. The chants, if they ever echoed, have long since dissolved into sand and wind. What remains are impressions, scents trapped in stone pigments whispering memories, scrolls written by steady hands in flickering light. But if the question remains unsettled, the fascination endures. We still wonder what the priests saw when the smoke curled just right, when the brew took hold, when the walls began to sing. Were they lifted, changed, or simply lost in their own careful theater? There is no final verdict here, only threads to follow, paths to trace back into mystery. Whether skeptical or enchanted, the scholars agree on one thing. The Egyptians left us clues, half hidden, half lit, waiting. And so, you step back from the imagined temple, still trailing hints of incense and story. The torches go out. The chants fade. All that's left is a hush, and a question gently echoing. But the hush is not empty. It carries with it something invisible, yet unforgettable. A trace in the air, a curl of scent that refuses to fade. And before the silence fully settles, your senses are tugged once more by your nose. You slip through the sunlit corridors of ancient Egypt, where walls whisper secrets in painted hieroglyphs, and every doorway breathes out a different scent. Here to smell is to survive and to belong. The nose is your guide, your badge, your personal oracle. Everyday Egyptians believed that smell connected them directly to the gods. Fragrance wasn't just pleasant, it was sacred. The word kai-fi, alone the name for a thick resinous perfume burned at dusk in temples, was spoken like a spell. According to priests, when the smoke of Kifi curled into the heavens, it carried prayers directly to the divine. Some scholars argue scent had even more practical uses. In a land where heat cooked everything by noon, perfumed cones and body oils weren't luxuries, they were daily necessities. These people didn't just bathe, they prepared. Before heading into the streets, men and women dabbed themselves with scented oils, placed wax cones on their wigs, and surrounded themselves with incense, essentially walking around in portable olfactory halos. Oddly enough, the nose also played a role in justice. In the temple courts, certain cases involved scent identification rituals. A suspect might be asked to describe or recreate a particular perfume blend, the idea being that only the guilty would recognize the smell involved in a crime. Or so one 19th century translator believed. Others say it might have been metaphorical. Either way, it tells you a lot about how scent shaped Egyptian logic. One whiff of lily or frankincense could evoke not just comfort, but cosmic alignment. Inscriptions on tomb walls tell of smells pleasing to Ra, or fit for Osiris, elevating fragrance into a moral force. And yes, certain smells were considered too divine for common use. Some were restricted to royalty or temples, though surviving evidence suggests people got around those bans with surprising creativity. Black market myrrh, anyone. As you wander deeper through Egypt's sensory maze, keep your nose open. The story's just begun. A faint sweetness lingers in the air, like syrup warmed on a temple brazier. It's the scent of Kaifi, sticky, potent, and almost holy. You follow the trail through the temple doors and into a cloud of smoke that smells like oranges, raisins, cinnamon, and something darker. Maybe myrrh, maybe time itself. Kaifi wasn't just perfume. It was a mood, a moment, a ritual. Originally burned only by priests at sunset, it was thought to soothe the gods into sleep and gently open the gates between heaven and earth. Recipes varied from era to era, but the most famous included over a dozen ingredients: honey wine, resin calamus, juniper, and frankincense, ground into a paste and left to mature like wine or cheese. Eventually, it wasn't just for temples. Ordinary households, especially wealthier ones, began mixing their own simplified versions. It became part of bedtime routines, love letters, and illness remedies. Want to impress your dinner guests? Burn a little Kaifi in the corner. Want your crush to notice you dab a bit behind your ears? Some historians debate whether the democratization of Kifi marked a religious decline or simply a rising middle class flexing its olfactory muscles. After all, scent in Egypt was always layered with power. The closer you got to smelling like a deity, the closer you were to becoming one, at least in social terms. But there was also a tactile side to this legendary blend. Making Kaifi took hours of labor. Ingredients were crushed with stone mortars, then sifted, boiled, dried, and kneaded like dough. In one surviving recipe from the Temple of Edfu, the entire process is described in mystical language. He who stirs the wine shall chant. He who warms the honey shall not speak ill. In other words, even making Kaifi was a spiritual act. And the results, supposedly mesmerizing. Ancient texts claim that inhaling it cured headaches, calmed nightmares, and improved memory. Plutarch, writing centuries later, said it could delight the senses and elevate the soul, which is just a poetic way of saying it smelled amazing. Oddly enough, modern reconstructions of Kifi often disappoint. Despite following the same ancient instructions, modern perfumers complain that the scent comes out too sour, too sharp, or weirdly musty. Some blame modern ingredient differences. Our cinnamon isn't their cinnamon. Others wonder if the formulas left out secret temple techniques now lost to time. Still, the fascination lingers. Museums and laboratories around the world have tried to rebottle the past. One even recreated a Kai-Fi batch based on residue found in an alabaster jar sealed for 2,000 years. According to a curator's note, it smelled like dried fruit rolled in antique incense, and not in a bad way. So here you are, nose deep in history's most mystical scent, realizing it was never just about the perfume. It was about presence, about offering a part of yourself to the air, and hoping the air returned something divine. Let the smoke curl higher. You're not done dreaming yet. The midday sun hits you like a wall, hot, dry, and absolutely unforgiving. You're in the heart of a working-class courtyard, and every stone seems to radiate heat. But what's surprising isn't the sweat. It's the scent. Even here amid dusty sandals and sun-bleached linen, there's a whiff of something pleasant lotus mint, maybe a touch of cedar. In Egypt, the climate was a full-time character in people's lives. Summers hovered well above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and water wasn't always easy to access. Yet despite this, Egyptians were obsessed with cleanliness. Public bathhouses were rare, but private routines were meticulous. People washed multiple times a day using scented natron, a natural salt blend, and scrubbed with powders made from crushed shells or sand. Sweat was unavoidable, but bad odor, culturally unacceptable. Egyptians didn't just tolerate the heat, they found ways to fragrance their way through it. Scented oils were rubbed onto arms and necks, perfume wax cones were worn on wigs, and even laundry was steeped in herbal rinses. Linen garments so light they barely registered as clothing held onto these fragrances, just long enough to make a good impression in the marketplace or temple. There's a quirky detail worth sniffing out. The ancient equivalent of deodorant was often a paste made from acacia resin goose fat and crushed carob. Smelled decent, worked, debatably. But, as one scholar wryly noted, it's unclear whether the goal was to mask odor or simply out-weird it. And then there's the question of wigs. Most Egyptians shaved their heads to stay cool and clean, but wigs were serious business. High-status individuals owned several each scented differently, depending on the occasion: frankincense for temple visits, blue lotus for feasts, myrrh for funerals. The wax cones often placed atop them slowly melted in the sun, releasing fragrance in slow, syrupy drips down the hair and shoulders. Not everyone had access to these luxuries, of course. Workers and farmers made do with local herbs, mint crushed into oil thyme mixed with vinegar, or lemongrass steeped in clay pots. Some even burned strips of linen soaked in scented resin to bathe in smoke when water wasn't available. Researchers still debate how widespread these habits were among the poorest classes. Some argue that the emphasis on scent was more aspirational than actual for laborers. But tomb illustrations do show oil jars and perfumed items next to beds even in modest graves, which suggests at least a whiff of everyday olfactory luxury was within reach. Even funerary texts reference body scent, noting whether a person smelled of the field or smelled as the gods do. That tells you something. The way you smelled wasn't just social, it was spiritual. So here you are standing under a hot Egyptian sun, feeling the sweat bead on your brow, and suddenly aware that you too are part of this ancient olfactory conversation. The heat is heavy, yes, but it's also perfumed with history. Let's keep walking. Something fragrant is always just around the next corner. The air shifts cooler now, not from weather, but from stone. You've stepped inside a tomb, and the temperature dips like the hush after a hymn. It smells sweet. Not in the way of fresh fruit or flowers, but in the dense, heady scent of resins and old wood. You recognize it almost immediately: myrrh. The ancient Egyptians didn't merely preserve their dead, they perfumed them into the afterlife. Mummification was a sacred, fragrant ritual, and every layer of linen carried the weight of olfactory devotion. Wrapped between folds were salves of frankincense, myrrh, cedar oil, and imported tree resins, sticky, potent substances that sealed the body from decay and whispered of divine approval. You imagine the process over 70 days, priests anointing a still form, muttering spells, rubbing in layers of perfumed oil until the very scent seemed to chant back. Every nostril was plugged with cinnamon bark, every ear lined with spiced wax. The heart might be removed, but the smell, that stayed sacred. One of the quirkiest details comes from Herodotus, who claimed bodies were sometimes filled with crushed cassia and sewn shut with palm fiber. Other mummies, when opened in modern labs, revealed unexpected ingredients: bitumen, tar, beeswax, and even traces of ancient pine. Scholars still puzzle over regional recipe variations, whether they were religious practical or simply based on what was available. Some mummies smell distinctly sweet even today. One famous noblewoman's remains reportedly gave off a lingering aroma of frankincense 2 centuries after excavation. A museum director once joked, "She's outlasted every perfume bottle in our collection." But embalming wasn't just about preservation. Smell signified purity. To be buried with sacred scent was to align your body with divine order. Temples taught that gods recognized the righteous by their aroma, much like a parent might recognize a child by the feel of their hand. The logic was both spiritual and symbolic. Not everyone could afford this fragrant send-off. While royalty and elite families underwent full-scale scented mummification, commoners often relied on abbreviated versions, just a little resin here, a dab of cedar oil there. And yet, even in humble burials, archaeologists have found traces of aromatic substances tucked near the body or painted on sarcophagi. The desire to smell divine even in death was universal. There's scholarly disagreement about how much perfume was used versus how much we assume was used based on surviving texts. Some researchers believe we overestimate the prevalence of imported myrrh and underestimate the use of local, more affordable herbs. But whether buried in cassia or calamus, the aim was always the same: to greet the gods with a scent too holy to ignore. So, as you stand here in the tombs, quiet inhaling that stubborn ghost of resin and pine, you begin to understand. In ancient Egypt, even the dead spoke in scent. Follow the aroma upward, there's still more to explore above ground. Step outside again, and the world erupts with noise and aroma. You're in the middle of a bustling Theban marketplace, where donkeys bray, vendors shout, and the scent of humanity mingles with spices and smoke. It's chaos, but fragrant chaos. Thebes wasn't just a political and religious hub. It was also a scent capital, with open-air stalls that doubled as perfumeries. You can almost smell the competition: the saffron and sandalwood, from India cinnamon, from Ceylon cedar, imported from Lebanon. One vendor waves a bundle of dried rose petals under your nose. Another beckons you toward a stand where unguents bubble in copper kettles. Most Egyptians couldn't travel far, but their noses did. Spices and perfume ingredients came from Arabia Punt and beyond. Market stalls often carried wares that had moved through a dozen hands and across hundreds of miles. Caravans of myrrh carried by camels or frankincense carried in reed baskets down the Nile. It was a global supply chain, powered by aroma. A quirky detail: one travel account describes perfume sellers using monkeys to guard their stalls. Whether this is literal truth or ancient exaggeration is unclear, but the image is delightful: a capuchin glaring protectively over a pile of lotus paste. You stop at a stall where a young boy grinds blue lotus into oil with a pestle. The petals stain his fingers indigo. He smiles, offering you a whiff. The smell is sweet narcotic and vaguely wine-like. Ancient texts say blue lotus induced a dreamlike state when inhaled deeply, possibly due to mild psychoactive properties. Scholars still debate this, with some suggesting it was used ceremonially, others that it was simply a mood enhancer before festivals. Whatever the case, it's a reminder scent wasn't just decoration, it was experience. People didn't just smell perfume, they felt it, sometimes even danced it. Certain blends were burned before specific songs, others anointed before marriage proposals. One scroll even lists which perfumes should be used during arguments, presumably to soften the outcome. And the markets were democratic in a way temples were not. You didn't have to be a priest or noble to buy a bit of cinnamon or rosewater. Some vendors sold diluted versions for poorer customers, and others offered seasonal deals, 4 drops of myrrh for a handful of barley, or a scrap of perfume cloth in exchange for a carved bead. Researchers continue to debate how regulated these markets were. Some believe there were scent guilds or temple-sponsored stalls. Others think the market operated more freely, with local vendors crafting their own blends on the spot. What's clear is that competition was fierce, and perfumers had reputations to uphold. A well-scented merchant could draw customers from blocks away. A bad batch that could ruin you. There's even a preserved complaint letter in a temple archive accusing a vendor of selling water in place of rose, which in ancient terms was practically slander. So you walk on caught in the fragrant labyrinth of commerce, where every stall is a story, and every aroma a memory. The sun hangs low now, casting gold across the courtyards. You follow a figure, tall, linen-robed, carrying a small alabaster jar. She's not a priestess or noblewoman, just a vendor's wife preparing for dinner. She pauses at a basin, uncorks the jar, and dips 2 fingers into its contents, perfumed oil. For ancient Egyptians, oil wasn't optional. It was daily armor. Sweat, wine, sun, and sand battered the skin constantly, so oiling up was part of basic hygiene. But unlike modern sunscreen or moisturizer, these oils carried powerful scents: rose, almond, cinnamon, even lemongrass, turning skincare into a sensory statement. It wasn't just for women. Men used oils just as frequently, especially those who worked outdoors or in temples. Scribes, soldiers, farmers. Everyone had a personal oil blend suited to their role and means. Higher status meant rarer ingredients, sandalwood, spikenard, even imported Persian ambergris. The less wealthy made do with castor oil or crushed herbs. A charming image survives on a tomb wall, a young man leaning toward his lover, offering her a lotus-shaped vial. Scholars believe this may be the oldest depiction of bringing your date perfume, which raises the question, was that oil gift for her, or a subtle hint? There's some debate about how widespread these practices really were. While elite tomb art shows lavish oil use, archaeological digs of common homes sometimes lack containers or residue. Some historians argue oils were aspirational use during festivals or feasts, but not daily for everyone. Others believe the absence of remains is due to the fragility of organic containers, like reeds and leather. Regardless, oil held social meaning. Applying it showed respect to yourself, to your guests, and even to the gods. Visitors entering a home might be offered a bit of perfumed oil as part of greeting etiquette, much like we offer drinks today. Come in, cool off scent yourself before the stew arrives. And oils weren't static, they evolved. Over centuries, blends became more complex, even gendered. Some formulas were labeled for a woman's neck, or for a warrior's sandals. Yes, scented footwear was apparently a thing. Quirky fact: in one surviving papyrus, an official complains of unfit oil given to the scribes, which caused a rash during a temple ceremony. Whether it was a bad blend or a political prank, we'll never know. You watch now as the woman smooths oil along her arms. She's not rushing. Each motion is deliberate, reverent, like a miniature rite. Her skin catches the last of the light gleaming. As she passes, the breeze carries her scent, subtle, spicy, calming. In a world without refrigeration, AC or deodorant perfumed oil was more than luxury. It was identity. It was how you said, "This is me, and yes, I smell good. Keep walking." The night air is coming, and with it new rituals of fragrance. Evening arrives slowly in Egypt, as if reluctant to extinguish the day's last rays. Lamps flicker on one by one, and with them comes something else, the sweet curl of smoke. From homes big and small, plumes of incense rise like sleepy prayers. You follow one trail to its source, a modest brick house with a clay bowl smoldering in the doorway. Incense wasn't a temple luxury. It was everywhere. Wealthy villas and humble shacks alike burned it daily, whether to purify rooms, please ancestral spirits, or simply keep the mosquitoes confused. You breathe in deeply, hints of juniper, sandalwood, and dried orange peel. It's not dramatic, it's domestic. Inside, a family settles for the night. The mother drops another chunk of resin onto the coals, releasing a crackle and puff. The father fans it gently with a palm frond. The children yawn. This is the scent of winding down. Ancient Egyptian homes often had designated incense spots, flat stones or little hollows in the wall where charcoal could be kept burning slowly. Certain times of day came with expected scents, cool, minty blends for dawn, warm, spicy ones for dusk. Morning might smell like basil and cedar, evening like cardamom and patchouli. Some incense was homemade, pounded in mortars with dried herbs, and stored in palm leaf bundles. Others came pre-mixed, bought from street vendors or temples. There were even travel-size incense kits, clay pots with space for a wick, perfect for on-the-go purification or quick spiritual realignment. A curious document from a provincial town lists an official complaint about unblessed incense used at the wrong hour. Whether this was a theological issue or just bad scheduling is up for debate. Some scholars argue incense carried strict timing rules tied to astrological calendars. Others think these guidelines were more social than cosmic. What's clear is that incense bridged every class. While perfume oils were often status symbols, a bit of good smoke was attainable for almost anyone. Priests used the same ingredients that farmers burned, just in greater quantity and perhaps with fancier bowls. Even animals got their share. Cats were sometimes brushed with smoke to elevate their spirit, especially those tied to the goddess Bastet. That might explain a surviving wall painting showing a cat eyes half-lidded sitting in a coil of incense smoke like it's starring in a perfume ad. The practical side of incense can't be ignored either, with livestock, stagnant water, and tightly packed homes keeping the air fragrant was both spiritual and sensible. Incense drove away pests, masked illness, and added dignity to otherwise messy realities. As the family you're watching begins to doze, the incense bowl is placed just beside the doorway. A thin stream continues to rise, mingling with the stars. You step outside again, noticing more trails, some sharp, some sweet, all weaving together above the rooftops, like an invisible net of memory and meaning. And in that haze of shared scent, the city dreams. Further down the avenue where statues cast long shadows and the walls are etched with glory, the air grows thicker, less from heat, more from ambition. You've arrived at the palatial domain of those who wielded fragrance not as comfort, but as command. Here, scent was strategy, and no one wielded it better than Cleopatra. Egyptian royalty understood the political power of perfume, while commoners wore oils to refresh and connect to the divine queens and pharaohs transformed scent into soft propaganda. Imagine entering a chamber where your rival's first sensation isn't your words, but the seductive waft of cardamom and lotus. It disarms. It declares presence before speech ever begins. Cleopatra's reputation as a perfumed enchantress wasn't just romantic exaggeration. Historical accounts describe her soaking the sails of her ships in jasmine and rose oil so that foreign dignitaries would smell her arrival before they saw her. One Roman wrote that the winds grew sweet when she passed, a metaphor perhaps, but rooted in deliberate aromatic spectacle. Another royal scent wielder was Hatshepsut, the only woman to rule as pharaoh in full regalia. She commissioned vast incense expeditions to Punt, not just for religious rites, but for personal use. Reliefs on her temple walls show fragrant trees being carried home like treasure. Some scholars argue these scenes were more than record, they were scent-based power flexes. Look what I can make the world smell like. A lesser-known quirk. Egyptian rulers sometimes perfumed scrolls sent to enemies or allies. One missive discovered centuries later still bore the ghostly imprint of spikenard. Theories abound. Perhaps it was a seduction tactic, or perhaps a chemical warning cloaked in sweetness. Historians disagree on how consistently scent politics were practiced. Some believe Cleopatra was the exception, not the rule, citing her Greco-Egyptian heritage as the reason for her perfume theatrics. Others argue all major pharaohs used scent to shape perception, just in subtler ways than history remembered. Regardless, perfume became inseparable from persona. Royal portraits often included scent cones painted atop wigs, even in stone carvings, to signify eternal elegance. Pharaohs didn't just look divine, they smelled the part, and scent extended beyond their persons. Palace halls were scented with resinous incense floors, sprinkled with dried herbs, and fountains occasionally filled with rose water. Visitors stepping into a royal space weren't just impressed by the architecture, they were enveloped in curated olfactory grandeur. One curious anecdote from an envoy's letter recounts a banquet where the hostess wore no jewelry, but entered trailing an aroma of cinnamon and neroli so potent even the dogs turned their heads. Whether true or not, the story endured because it captures the essence of royal scent, politics' allure as influence. So, as you stand now in the shadow of queens and conquerors, inhale deeply. The power you smell wasn't won by swords alone, it was bottled. Let's leave the court behind now and wander toward those who made these scents possible. The palace fades behind you, and in its place rises a different rhythm, softer, steadier, filled with the sounds of scraping, grinding, pouring. You're in a workshop now. It's dark, warm, and smells like 1,000 forgotten gardens. Welcome to the world of the perfume makers, where scent begins in silence. These artisans were chemists, priests, and poets all in one. Every vial they bottled held more than aroma, it held formula, memory, and trade secret. The walls here are lined with clay jars labeled in hieratic scrawl: cassia bark, marjoram, myrrh, cinnamon leaf. You watch as a woman in a linen tunic carefully grinds frankincense into powder with a polished basalt stone. The motion is slow, rhythmic, almost meditative. Perfume making was laborious. First came drying or steeping, then grinding, boiling, and filtering. The base oils, often moringa castor or bolanos, were left in the sun for days to absorb the essence of the herbs and flowers. Some recipes called for aging, others for daily stirring under moonlight. Not superstition, just practice. Consistency mattered. A lesser-known detail: many perfumers worked in teams, not alone. One person ground ingredients, another strained the oils, a third blended by nose. Apprenticeship could last years. Some households even specialized in one scent: family balsamic resins, sharp citrus, or floral-heavy blends. One surviving scroll from a Theban perfumery suggests a family had produced the royal anointing oil for 3 generations. There's still debate about how secretive these makers were. Some historians believe recipes were closely guarded within families never written down. Others argue many blends were public knowledge, with variation coming from ingredient quality or personal flair. The truth, as usual, may be somewhere in between. What's certain is that the best perfumers were in demand. They traveled with royal caravans, consulted with priests, and occasionally crafted custom blends for visiting dignitaries. One Roman writer grumbled that Egyptian oils outlasted conversation, which might explain why Roman imports tried to imitate them for decades. You notice the workshop floor is coated in a fine dust-powdered herbs and ash from past batches. The air feels thick, almost chewable. A worker opens a nearby jar, and the room is flooded with anise and thyme. It's both soothing and slightly dizzying. This is no accident. Perfume makers didn't just create scent, they designed mood. Oddly, these artisans were rarely depicted in Egyptian art. Their tools appear, but their faces don't. Perhaps their anonymity was part of the mystique. Or maybe the true power lay in the product, not the hand that made it. One story tells of a perfumer who was buried with a vial labeled for Ra's delight. Whether he ever scented a god's chamber or merely hoped to, we'll never know. But the implication is clear. His work wasn't just practical, it was aspirational, eternal. You step back from the table as another jar is opened. This time it's Blue Lotus, sweet, thick, intoxicating. The makers smile. They've been expecting you. Let's follow their trade beyond the Nile. The scent trails don't stop at Egypt's borders. They stretch out like silk ribbons across deserts, over mountains, and down to the glittering Red Sea. You find yourself standing beside a caravan, camels swaying under bundles of resin handlers, adjusting woolen wraps, and the air humming with anticipation and spice. These are the frankincense trails, and they smell like global ambition. Frankincense and myrrh were more than ritual supplies. They were currency. Ancient Egypt imported them in vast quantities from the mysterious land of Punt, possibly modern-day Eritrea or Somalia. The route was grueling. Goods moved by ship when weather allowed, or by camel caravans that trudged through brutal terrain for weeks. Heat theft, illness, all for a bag of dried tree sap that could fetch its weight in silver. The expeditions were orchestrated with precision. Trade envoys traveled with scribes, guards, cooks, even embalming specialists just in case. One wall relief from Queen Hatshepsut's mortuary temple shows an entire fleet returning with live myrrh trees in tow. Whether those trees survived replanting remains unknown, but the attempt itself was bold transplanting fragrance. A curious detail, some trade routes included scent stations, rest stops, where incense was burned for local gods to bless the journey. These smoky rituals served both spiritual and social functions, helping forge ties with tribes along the way. Some scholars believe these stations also functioned as olfactory markers, smell the cedar, and you're 2 days from the coast. There's still debate over the scale of these networks. Some historians argue Egypt relied heavily on Punt and southern Arabia, while others suggest overland Nubian routes played a bigger role. Archaeological finds along both paths show residues of cinnamon cloves and even sandalwood, none of them native to Africa. The olfactory map was enormous. The handlers you're watching now are experts. They wrap each resin lump in palm leaves, layer it with dried lavender to preserve scent, then pack it into reed baskets lined with linen. Not one whiff is wasted. Even the camels are adorned with fragrant oils to mask their smell during diplomatic arrivals. At port towns like Elim or Saw, these bundles are offloaded into storerooms beside cedar crates and ceramic perfume jars. From there, they move up the Nile bound for temples and royal courts. Some perfumes never make it that far. Merchants siphon off small quantities to sell on the black market or as bribes. The sea brings its own scent to brine fish, and the sharp tang of salt-soaked wood. Sailors rub scented wax on ropes to ward off mold and bad spirits. In one old sea chant preserved phonetically in a burial text, mariners pray, "May the winds carry cinnamon, not screams." You inhale now and smell it all: sweat smoke, spice ambition. The perfume of trade where every scent carries a signature of far-off lands and risk. Let's follow those jars inland to the temples that made scent sacred. The temple rises before you, colossal columns, etched with God's sun-dappled courtyards where time folds inward. But as you step inside, it isn't the architecture that overwhelms you. It's the scent, thick, sacred, deliberate. You've arrived at the spiritual heart of ancient Egypt, where perfume was an accessory it was offering. In temple life, scent marked every ritual. Incense was burned 5 times a day each round, with its own blend timing and purpose. Morning smoke woke the gods, midday kept them pleased, and nightfall lured them into dreams. These weren't symbolic gestures, they were believed to sustain divine presence. Without proper fragrance, gods might simply drift away. You stand near a brazier watching a priest sprinkle pellets of kufi and benzoin into the coals. A blue-gray plume rises curling toward a statue's face. The priest doesn't speak. He simply closes his eyes and breathes as if sharing the same air with the deity might carry his thoughts farther than words. Many temples had their own scent recipes, some recorded in cryptic formulae on walls, others passed down orally. One inscription in Edfu lists perfume of the sky as containing storax honey and red wine. Oil of eternity involved blue lotus frankincense and ground gold. Whether symbolic or literal, these mixtures shaped how gods were experienced through noses as much as eyes. And overlooked quirk temple doorkeepers were sometimes responsible for preparing incense, not priests. It was considered a sacred gatekeeping task, since they opened the scent, as one might open a ritual path. Some scholars still argue whether this was ceremonial or pragmatic temple staffing. Perfume also marked human roles in divine space. Priests anointed themselves with oils before every rite. Their scent signaled readiness and reverence. The more sacred the ceremony, the more elaborate the oil. Some wore 3 scents at once, each layered for meaning. Think of it as spiritual cologne, worn to attract celestial attention. Temple festivals amplified all of this. Picture thousands of people gathered outside the sanctuary, priests carrying statues of gods on litters, each one wrapped in clouds of aromatic smoke. On feast days, scent wasn't contained, it spilled out across cities. Children waved bundles of herbs, dancers perfumed their hands, and even animals wore floral collars. There is no scholarly consensus on how long these rituals lasted, unchanged. Some believe Greco-Roman influence diluted the scent traditions, shifting them toward theater. Others argue that even late-period temples still honored the same olfactory calendar passed down for centuries. A single alabaster bottle found beneath a temple floor contained hardened residue that, when rehydrated, released a faint, unmistakable note of cinnamon, as if the god who once inhabited that altar had left behind a breath of memory. You leave the inner chamber slowly, your garments infused with sacred smoke. It clings to your skin, marking you, however briefly, as participant, not just observer. Let's now unroll the scrolls that kept these recipes alive long after the gods went silent. You're in a quiet scribe's chamber now, where papyrus rustles like dry leaves and ink smells faintly of soot and acacia. Light slants in through a carved lattice, illuminating a scroll half unrolled on a reed mat. But this isn't a letter or a royal edict, it's a recipe. A perfume recipe written in delicate looping script, preserved not just as craft, but as knowledge. Egyptians didn't always rely on oral tradition alone. Many perfumery recipes were carefully documented, some in temple libraries, others in household records. These scrolls blend poetry with practicality. Ingredients are listed in order measurements given by weight or pinch, and instructions phrased like miniature rituals. Boil the oil until it hums, one says. Another, grind the rose petals before the stars fade. It's not always clear who wrote them. Some bear the names of priests or physician perfumers. Others are anonymous, suggesting everyday use. Historians debate whether these scrolls were intended as trade manuals, magical guides, or domestic handbooks. The ambiguity is part of their allure. One papyrus, now housed in a European archive, lists over 20 scent formulas, each tied to a season, mood, or ailment. Scent for joyful day, made with coriander and honey. Oil for morning, with juniper and black cumin. Even blend for sleep, a mix of mandrake fig milk and warm resin. There's a charming detail in one recipe, a note in the margin written by a second hand, warning not to overheat the lotus, or you'll lose the scent in your dinner, possibly a joke, possibly advice from someone who would learn the hard way. Some scholars argue these texts represent an early form of cosmetic pharmacology, a merging of fragrance, wellness, and ritual. Others believe they were more symbolic, written to invoke order and beauty in a world where chaos always lurked. Scrolls weren't the only records either. Some recipes were inscribed on tomb walls or temple stones meant to last forever. A few blend scent, with spells suggesting that perfumes had magical properties, protecting travelers, attracting lovers, even calming angry deities. Oddly enough, certain recipes appear in multiple sites with slight variations. Cinnamon quantities differ. The oil base changes. This suggests a kind of regional customization, perfume traditions passed from hand to hand, tweaked like favorite family meals. Reconstructing these blends today is a scholarly challenge. Some ingredients are extinct or unidentifiable. Sweet wood from the river's mouth could be half a dozen plants. Others, like sun-thickened oil, are more poetic than precise. Yet researchers still try grinding, steeping, and bottling the past. In one modern lab, a team recreated an ancient blend known as the Breath of Ra, based on a formula from the Temple of Kam Ambo. The result? A thick amber-colored oil that smelled like citrus rind aged wine in desert heat. You imagine scribes of old hunched over their scrolls, ink-stained and fragrant, capturing scent in syllables. Not just for the moment, but for eternity. Next, let's see how smell shaped status and separated the perfumed from the perspiring. You return to the city streets now, where scent doesn't just linger, it labels. It's in the air, yes, but also in the glances exchanged between passers-by, the way someone's head turns at a whiff or doesn't. Here in ancient Egypt, odor isn't just aroma, it's identity, it's class. The nobleman walking past you smells of imported cardamom and rare rose oil. His linen tunic is crisp, his sandals dust-free. Meanwhile, the farmer across the square, bent beneath a basket of leeks, carries the smell of sun-warmed onions, animal sweat, and earth. Both are valid, both authentic. But one signals prestige, the other labor. In Egypt, scent was a social marker as visible as jewelry or chariot wheels. High-status individuals layered expensive oils, changed fragrances for different occasions, and employed servants to reapply them throughout the day. Commoners might rely on a single blend if they could afford it, or simply bathe in aromatic smoke from herbs gathered along the Nile. A quirky law from the Middle Kingdom reportedly prohibited certain perfumes from being used by non-priests during festivals. Some historians think this was to preserve their sacred aura. Others argue it was a way to gatekeep elite blends. Either way, the message was clear. Your scent said who you were and who you weren't. Even the architecture of status smelled different. Elite homes had scent gardens, small courtyards planted with herbs like marjoram mint and sweet flag. As breezes passed through, they carried soft fragrance into the rooms. Workers' homes, by contrast, might smell of fish paste and old smoke, with only a sprig of mint hanging from the doorway for luck. There is scholarly disagreement about how rigid these olfactory boundaries were. Some researchers suggest markets offered enough variety for the lower classes to emulate upper-class scents occasionally. Others believed the expense and exclusivity of ingredients like myrrh or saffron made such mimicry rare and short-lived. One curious artifact, a clay scent jar inscribed with, "For a man of middle strength," hints at a middle-class olfactory ambition. Not too costly, not too plain, just fragrant enough to be noticed, without overstepping the invisible boundary between merchant and noble. Perfume was also used to reinforce hierarchy in temples and palaces. Servants wore simpler scents, or none at all, while priests were anointed head to toe in blends mixed days in advance. Some rituals even required priests to change fragrance during the ceremony, one oil for the greeting of the god, another for offering bread, a final one for the god's return to slumber. Children weren't exempt. Noble infants were often perfumed shortly after birth, while poorer families might save up for a single scented oil to use sparingly across seasons. One recorded birth blessing includes the line, "May his skin know sandalwood before it knows the sun." So, here you are, nose first in a world where scent charts the social map, where smelling rich matters just as much as looking rich, and sometimes more. Let's go deeper still into the strange, sometimes mythical origins of those scents. The scent shifts again this time to something wild, less crafted. It's sharper animalic, tinged with something sweet and slightly unsettling. You've wandered into the stories behind the smells, where ingredients weren't just gathered, but believed to be gifted hunted, or even stolen from the divine. In ancient Egypt, perfumes weren't all floral and polite. Many included musk from animals, ambergris from the sea, and myth, laced herbs that came with stories as complex as their chemistry. Some of the most prized scents had unlikely origins like civet musk, extracted from glands near a wildcat's tail, or oil infused with jackal fur for spiritual protection. One scroll refers to a blend called Night's Voice, which included essence of black hound and crushed lily. Scholars believe this was a reference to Anubis, the jackal-headed god of the afterlife. Whether symbolic or literal, it illustrates how myth and biology mixed freely in Egypt's perfume past. Take the blue lotus again. This floating flower was not only used in oils, but also in love potions and funeral rites. It appears in art hovering over wine cups, clutched in dancers' hands, even pressed to the lips of gods. Some researchers argue it contained mild narcotics. Others insist it was purely symbolic. But the Egyptians clearly saw something divine in its scent, dreamy, intoxicating, and deeply personal. Then there were the gods of scent themselves. Nefertem, the lotus-born deity, was said to rise from the primordial waters, carrying a perfume so powerful it soothed even Ra's sun-weary bones. Devotees wore amulets of his image, a young man with a lotus on his head, and offered him oils during festivals. His job wasn't just to smell good, it was to protect the balance between order and chaos, using scent. Curiously, some perfumes were believed to have a kind of spiritual memory. A blend used during a healing ritual, for example, was thought to remember the illness and help prevent its return. Recipes sometimes included phrases like, "to recall joy," or "to banish yesterday." In this sense, scent was history-bottled emotion that could be summoned at will, but not every ingredient was noble. One lesser-known recipe includes crocodile dung mixed with thyme and used according to the scribe as protection from betrayal. Whether this was worn as perfume or smeared on thresholds is unclear. Either way, it proves that beauty and belief often took strange paths. Modern researchers still argue over how much of these mythical blends were real and how much was ritual language. Some think the stranger recipes were metaphor-coded language for rare or lost plants. Others suggest early perfumers truly experimented with animal, mineral, and mystery alike. As you inhale now, you realize these scents weren't just concoctions. They were beliefs in liquid form, each drop carrying a tale of gods, beasts, and the people who sought to smell like both. Come now, Let's return to the present and see what survives when modern noses meet ancient formulas. Back in the modern world, under sterile lab lights and behind fingerprint-smudged glass, a scientist unscrews a tiny vial. The room goes still. She raises it to her nose and inhales slowly. "It's smoky," she murmurs. "Sweet, but with something ancient." You're standing at the crossroads of time and chemistry where ancient Egyptian perfumes are being brought back to life, molecule by molecule. Reconstructing ancient scent isn't easy. Perfume doesn't fossilize, and even the best preserved residue is often just a smudge of sticky tar. But using advanced techniques, gas chromatography, mass spectrometry, and a fair amount of educated guesswork, researchers have begun decoding the sense of the past. They extract chemical signatures from sealed jars, grind residue from tomb walls, and compare those results to botanical references. In one notable project, scientists recreated a perfume believed to have been used by Cleopatra herself. Based on residue from a 2,000-year-old flask found near her likely palace site, the formula included myrrh, cardamom, olive oil, and a now extinct type of cinnamon. The result? Earthy, spicy, musky, not exactly what modern perfumeries sell, but something oddly comforting. There's debate, of course. Some scholars argue these reconstructions can't possibly capture the original scent. The oils have degraded, ingredients have mutated, and preparation methods can't be perfectly replicated. Others insist that even a partial match offers rare sensory access to the past, a way to smell history, as one archaeobotanist put it. One charming experiment involved perfumers and Egyptologists collaborating to recreate the festival of Opet scent, a temple blend thought to have been used during a major celebration. The mixture included blue lotus date wine, labdanum, and cedarwood. When burned, it reportedly made the lab smell like a golden afternoon. A quirky modern twist museums now occasionally offer smell stations, where visitors can sniff reimagined scents from ancient recipes. Some are hits like almond oil with marjoram, others less so like tar like kaife, or anything containing animal musk. One visitor famously recoiled from a myrrh blend and declared it smelled like funerals and old socks. Fair enough. And then there's the commercial angle. Boutique perfumeries have started releasing ancient-inspired lines with names like Pharaoh's Garden or Sands of Thebes. Purists scoff, but curious noses keep buying. After all, who doesn't want to smell like a queen from 1300 BCE? But maybe the real power of these reconstructions isn't in accuracy, it's in atmosphere. When you smell something ancient even imperfectly, it creates a connection, not just with a time or a place, but with a person, the one who first wore it, made it, or dreamed it. You close your eyes and imagine them an artisan grinding petals at dawn, a priest lighting incense at dusk, a mother oiling her child's skin before bed. Their scents faded, but not forgotten. And now, as the recreated aroma drifts gently through the lab, you breathe in. It's faint, it's imperfect, but it's real. And that perhaps is enough. Settle back now and let all those ancient fragrances fade like dusk over the Nile. Imagine the warm press of scented oil against your skin, the hush of incense curling toward painted ceilings, the slow melt of wax on a perfumed wig. You've traveled through bustling markets, shadowed temples, secret workshops, and returned with something rare, a memory you can't see or touch, but only smell. If this scent-soaked stroll through time helped you rest, you might quietly subscribe so we can wander together again. Maybe leave a thought in the comments and tell me where you're listening from and what hour the past found you tonight.